Okay, I think we'll begin if the team is ready. I think we'll begin. Good morning, everybody. Just checking you can hear me. Someone can nod or give a thumbs up or both. Yeah, excellent. Thank you. Welcome to this National Forum on Creative Practice Research Evaluation. For those who don't know me, I'm Craig Batty. I'm the president of the Australian Council of Deans and Directors of Creative Arts, or the DDCA. And it's really great to see so many people here today. We have quite a few people booked in to come, so the numbers will keep cranking up. It's really great to see many, a mixture here of academics, professional staff, and also university leaders from across Australia, New Zealand, and also I know we have some people here from overseas, so very welcome. I'd first like to begin by acknowledging the various custodians of the lands upon which we meet today. I'm on the lands of the Kaurna people in Adelaide, South Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. And if you would like to pop in the chat where you're coming from today, please feel free to do so. It'd be good to see a record of where people are. I'd also like to give a special welcome to colleagues who are joining us today from the Australian Research Council, the Australian Research Data Commons, and also Clarivate. They're here today, welcome. And also I'd like to welcome and say a big hi to our colleagues and friends from other national peak bodies across Australia and New Zealand who are joining us this morning. As you can see, this forum is being recorded, and we're planning to make this available on the DDCA website next week. So please do mind your P's and Q's today. And a reminder, if you could please just stay on mute until or unless you are speaking a bit later on. We'll explain the rules in a second. But please just keep yourself on mute while we've got people giving formal speeches. When we do open to questions later on, and we'll talk about the use of chat and live talking in a few minutes, but if you are speaking on the mic later, if you've got questions or comments, please try and keep to the point and brief. We've got quite obviously a time constraint today, and we do have a lot of people coming, so we'd like to ensure that everybody has a chance to speak. Now, for those who are not familiar with the DDCA, we are the National Council representing creative arts, education and research in Australia. And we spent the last couple of years developing a new strategic plan to broaden our remit and also to deepen our impact within the sector. This includes advocating for creative practice research and the value of non-traditional, or as we might prefer to call it, creative research outputs. And this is the focus of the forum today, particularly the notion of assessing and evaluating creative research. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Dr. Smiljana Glizovic now, who's going to give an overview of the structure of the session and also a bit of background to today's session.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Craig. So I will go through today's this structure of today's session. I will give a brief overview of the inspiration and aims of today's forum. We will then have 5 speakers speak for 5 minutes each on a given topic. These are intended as provocations for the discussion that we will have after all 5 speakers have presented. So at this time, we'll open the floor to you all, to all of the attendees for questions and comments. We encourage you to put any questions and comments in the chat box, which we will be monitoring throughout the session, so you can do that at any time. If you would like to jump on the mic after the 5 presenters have spoken, then we ask that you speak for no more than 1 or 2 minutes, just so that we can hear as many voices as possible. And there are a lot of people in the room today. We will be running a special issue of DDCA's online publication, Creative Matters. And this invites you all to make a submission to that edition on any of the topics that we're covering today. And this is the space where you can share your longer thoughts and ideas. You can see the topic areas that we're looking at today, as well as that call for submissions at the link that Ruth has just put in the chat. So the DDCA was inspired to hold this forum as an answer to the recommendation made by the Excellence in Research for Australia Transition Working Group for significant sector consultation. So we would like to enable conversations which will support further work in the direction of realising the stated aspirations and aims of the new era. We feel there needs to be a collective effort to create resources that can inform the architects of the new models for evaluation of creative practice research, its excellence and its impact. The ways in which creative practice research participates in philosophical, social, creative, political, intellectual spaces has developed rapidly over the last couple of decades. There's a lot of good literature evidencing this maturity and complexity of practice. But the literature on how to evaluate and assess this work has not evolved at the same pace. This conversation needs to develop in concert with the changing agendas and demands of industry, government, and university, as these in our particular context are so interlinked. And why this matters is that we have seen the gap between the development of the disciplines and the effective ways of doing the administration around the research. This has affected a range of things, from further development of the disciplines and potentials for collaboration, to the working environments and research cultures across universities and potential for people's career progressions. Unevenness is a key issue which the era and engagement and impact reviews exposed. Between disciplines and the methods of ranking, between peer review and data-driven metrics, between peer review reports. The stated new aspirations and intentions for ERA can be said to be noble, but it's not entirely clear how we're going to arrive at these aspirations. The path is certainly clearer for the citation-based and therefore the data-driven disciplines, but this is not so for the peer review disciplines such as creative practice research. So this forum, and hopefully a series of forums, is our attempt to fill in some of these gaps, to build the literature, to step out possible paths to arriving at a model that feels fair, that enables creative practice research to thrive in Australia and beyond. So we're now going to move on to the 5-minute presentations. I'm going to stop spotlighting myself because I'm about to introduce to you Professor Mia Lindgren. She's the Associate Dean Research in the College of Arts, Law and Education at the University of Tasmania. Her research examines forms of audio storytelling with attention to podcast journalism and public health communication. Mia's full bio can be found by following the link that Ruth has put in the chat. And Mia's topic today is on creative practice research and university cultures. Thank you so much, Mia.
Thank you. Thank you for tuning in today. And I want to acknowledge the Palawa people as the custodians of this unceded land in Lutravita, Tasmania, where I am today. And I see a few of my colleagues, which is lovely, in beautiful Nipaluna, Hobart, where the sun has just started to pour in through my window. When I started thinking about this talk, I asked Claude.ai to give me a list of words where the prefix non is included. So Claude said non-profit, non-negotiable, non-essential, and so on. And then the typical AI-generated definition. The non prefix is used to indicate the opposite, absence or exclusion of the root word's meaning. It signals a deviation from the standard, typical, or expected. As we know in the case of academic research, the standard, typical, or expected has long privileged the written text and traditional publishing classics like journal articles, book chapters, and books, which are, of course, primarily designed for and consumed within the academic community. I've been in academic leadership roles for over a decade now at different universities and participated in various processes that govern academic careers, such as promotion, probation, appointment panels. These committees are underpinned by professional conventions and capability frameworks built around the standard, typical, and expected, and of course fueled by financial models. Over time, however, and turbocharged by digital disruptions, I've seen a shift in how these career-defining panels view research in academic CVs. This changing culture has come from both sides. Academics have become more confident about the value of their own research practices and better at arguing that point. And the institution's increasingly literate about how creative practice fits into the broader research ecosystem. And we should be very proud of this, but of course we've got a long way to go. And today will be a welcomed discussion on this. Changing culture takes a long time, especially in old and rather conservative professions. But I hold great hope that the National Research Agenda focused on impact and what's often called the beneficiaries of the work that we do in higher education will help change an outdated and far too narrowly focused model and give that final push towards parity between NTROs, using the non for definition, and TROs. The shift key is that the purpose, format and intended audience of practice-related research is often more oriented towards non-academic stakeholders and real-world applications, rather than just satisfying academic publishing requirements or, for that matter, impressing other scholars. So here's a provocation of how practice-led creative practice research can create impactful outputs that align with an increasingly dominant national impact-driven research agenda, as noted in the Research University Accord. In an era where research is expected to demonstrate tangible benefits to society, economy, and the environment, creative practice research offers a powerful pathway to maximize research impact. Practice-related research is often designed and disseminated in ways that directly engage with what's known as end users and stakeholders outside academia. Whether it's an interactive data visualization informing public policy, a design prototype driving industry innovation, or a documentary film sparking social change, these outputs have the potential to build bridges between academia and the wider society. By expanding the definition of research excellence beyond just academic metrics, universities and funding bodies can incentivize researchers to undertake more applied, user-centric and interdisciplinary work. This shift can foster stronger collaborations with industry, government and community partners, ensuring research agendas are aligned with pressing societal challenges. The broadening of types of research outputs signals an exciting evolution in the research landscape, in my mind, one where impact and engagement, real-world application becomes the markers of success rather than just disciplinary prestige or citation counts. Leveraging this potential could be transformative, not just for the research community, but also for the communities that we serve. And just as a finishing point, I would argue that there's appetite to think about creative practice research in academia through a diversity and inclusivity lens. Embracing creative practice research can elevate the contributions of researchers from diverse backgrounds, disciplines, and methodological approaches. This inclusiveness aligns with growing calls for more equitable and representative research systems that serve the broadest possible public good. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mia. I'll just remind everyone that if you do have any questions or comments that are arising for you now that are specific to what Mia has just presented, you are welcome to put it in the chat straight away. We will be monitoring the chat throughout the session, or you can hold on to your comments and questions until the end and speak on mic. So I will now introduce you to Associate Professor Jessica Wilkinson from RMIT University, Writing and Publishing, Her creative practice research investigates what poetry can do for and within communities and or in collision with other nonfiction genres such as biography, history, and journalism. Jess's full bio can be seen in the chat that Ruth has just popped in there. And I will just bring Jess on for you.
Thanks, Mina. Hi, everyone. Thank you to the DDCA for inviting me to speak today. I'm coming to you from Wadawurrung land. So my field is creative writing, and I wanted to start with a brief anecdote in talking to the era submissions theme. Assessing in the 2018 ARC era round, the 5 universities I was assigned within my code had such wildly different approaches to putting up their top 30% representative samples that the lack of consensus on quality and how non-traditional research outputs were valued by the respective institutions was quite obvious. In one example, I won't get into specifics, but one university put up a countable output as constituting upwards of 60 poems, plus full books of poems. And as a poet, knowing the difficulties of publishing, I was a bit horrified by the suggestion that such an enormous quantities were required to demonstrate adequate quality. As a possible gaming strategy of the institution, it had the effect of exposing a catch-all approach of a poet researcher's outputs without demonstrating strong practice research purpose. But yet another example saw a university submit as samples images of the covers of outputs such as books, along with industry indicators of quality such as review excerpts and lists of prizes and accolades that the respective works had garnered, but puzzlingly no excerpts of the creative works themselves. How could it be? I thought that the work itself was not necessary to demonstrate quality. So in that same assessing round, there was everything between and around those examples submitted for assessment, demonstrating this very broad spectrum of understandings of quality creative practice research. Discussing this with colleagues that I consulted preparing for this session, who have also been assessors, revealed very similar anecdotes. And so we're clearly faced with problems of understanding the relationship between quality and quantity, and with how to demonstrate quality in fields that haven't developed in the academy according to, for instance, the scientific method. This caused me to reflect briefly on how strange it is that academic training acculturates us to the relatively standardised discursive model of this scholarly article, with its aims, evidence, arguments, and conclusions, and the methods of ranking that house and that model of knowledge dissemination, with Scamargo rankings and peer reviewing, but is at somewhat of a loss when faced with creative methodologies. But I think that this opens up some really exciting possibilities for us. And again, I was sort of reflecting on my own creative writing fields and now leading the way with hybrid critical creative dissertations, for example, which is quite strong in the higher degree research training space, and demonstrates our abilities to forge new discursive pathways that really not only document, but also maybe perform or attempt to enact the research. It could be in our hands then to propose alternative discursive methods for knowledge dissemination and accountability. So perhaps we could get more creative there. Some things that I think that we need to consider, and we have been considering, of course. First of all, the labour involved in assessment of writing research statements, preparing submissions, assessing internally and nationally must be weighed up because our current methods are not labour nor cost effective. It's great that creative practice outputs are accountable where the research aspect is not necessarily self-evident, but it comes with significant administrative burden, which was, of course, outlined in the ARC submission to the interim report of the university's accord. Second, what is the relationship between creative practice research and the industries that support and disseminate their public engagement and impact lifestyle? To what extent do these external or industry markers of approval indicate that good research has occurred? And to what extent are we leveraging those markers to retrofit strong research statements around our creative practice outputs? Third, to what extent do we want universities to have autonomy over their own priorities when it comes to assessing creative practice research? So we know that universities assign points and metrics to outputs in different ways, which is usually driven by institutional priorities. I could give examples there, but I'll run out of time. So I'm sure we're familiar with that in any case, but we could talk about that later. Fourth, is it possible to compare creative and artistic rigour and traditional academic rigour? I think in many cases there persists, and again, in consultation with colleagues, there can be this attitude that creative practice researchers and research can be naive, perhaps because we're made to squeeze practitioner knowledges into other modes of reporting that aren't necessarily a good fit. And finally, are there some creative practices that are better suited to the academy? How so and why? And how might assessment processes help us to expand academic frontiers to encompass rather than to exclude or ignore certain practices? So I'm going to run out of time, and I just briefly wanted to touch on some maybe speculative futures of assessment and what might be possible. And I've just got a couple of dot points. What if we allowed ourselves to go deeper into exploratory territory and to recognise that the goal is knowledge creation, not overproduction? What if fields got together to strategise our way of saying what is worth doing, and we proposed our best thing, and how might be the best way to go about that? That, of course, allows for interdisciplinary discussion and so on. How might we place emphasis on the enablers? What do people need for their disciplines and creative contributions to thrive? And a wild possibility, could we extract ourselves from metrics and from point systems to instead focus on researcher projects and creative practice research ecologies? So instead of statements and points and annual internal collection, what if we could encourage narratives, long-term goals, and deeper impacts? So I'll wind it up there. Thank you so much for listening.
Thanks, Jess. And thank you for the comments that are coming in the chat. You can keep doing that. We've got our eye on it. I will now introduce to you Professor Craig Batty, who is the Executive Dean of Uni SA Creative at the University of South Australia. He has published extensively on the topics of screenwriting practice, screenwriting theory, creative practice research, and doctoral supervision. Craig's full bio can be found at the link that Ruth has just put in the chat. And Craig's topic is on reviewer training and guidelines. And here I will give you Craig.
In the spotlight. Thanks, Mina, and also thanks, Jess. I think what I'm going to say builds really nicely on what you just said there. So the question that we've all asked many times, I'm sure, or thought at least, is do we agree on what we're looking for in research assessment in creative disciplines? As a DASH survey in 2018 revealed, assessors, or at least the ones surveyed, because it was quite a small pool of surveyants, had mixed views about what was important, from theoretical contributions to industry contributions to hybrid contributions and so on. And the caveat, "it depends," came up quite strongly in the results of that survey. There is still perhaps surprisingly, given the advances in the literature that we've developed, particularly in Australia around creative research, no consensus on what research excellence looks like. We know what creative practice research is, and we know why it's undertaken, but when and how do we know it is excellent, or in some cases not excellent? Might we be bold and put out a statement or similar around this? A bit like the DDCA manifesto that was published in 2023, which we'll link to in the chat in a second. Should we, perhaps by the Australian Research Council, be bolder and more specific in asserting the criteria for what excellence looks like, and of course impact as well? Have we been too accommodating of nuance and interpretation? Has this inadvertently undone us? And I'll just draw quickly here on the difference that I see between what I call research-enabled practice and practice-enabled knowledge. I'm very interested in definitions and semantics. And the difference between what a creative artifact that contributes to knowledge in and of itself compared to creative works, iterations, experiments that are a method from which to draw knowledge about process and practice. There are actually different contributions in these two models. The contribution to knowledge is different, and it's about different things, and they have different research questions as well. So because of this, we might ask, well, if we're looking at creative artifacts that are knowledge contributions or that are more method experimental sites for knowledge about practice or process, well, how do we judge excellence in these two different types of output? And sometimes you might think about different disciplinary traditions here. So for example, in creative writing and in screen production, it tends to be more artifact as contributing the knowledge in and of itself, sometimes in contemporary art, whereas sometimes in design in particular, and sometimes in contemporary art, you find that it's more about the process and the practice. So there's quite different contributions. Therefore, it raises the question, what is excellence? How do we look for it? How can we define it when the artifact itself is doing a different thing? If we want robust data and a level playing field for research evaluation, excellence, and impact, then we need to have a consistent and reliable data set. And I know the word data set is often disregarded in creative disciplines, but I think it's important that we do use it and think about what does that mean for creative disciplines rather than making us different all the time. We currently do not have a reliable data set of creative research outputs and its metadata nationally. Each university, as you all know, has its own way of collecting and assessing a creative research output, ranging from sophisticated digital systems in some universities to in-person committees where people literally bring in piles of materials and notes to table the discussion. And let's be honest, let's not ignore personal agendas here as well. For those who have been involved in assessing and creative research works, who can, hand on heart, say that they have never brought in themselves or seen from others personal opinions about someone's work, and how has that swayed assessment of their research outputs? I don't have enough hands on which to count how many times I've experienced and seen this across different universities, I have to say, not just the ones I've worked at. So how, therefore, can we be confident that we're all coming to the evaluation on the same basis with the same data, and therefore we're producing a national data set that is able to do a good, robust job of research evaluation? I just don't think at this current state it's possible. We're not doing it. But this is where a national fit-for-purpose NTRO, non-traditional research output, or preferably creative research output system informed by experts, built by experts with sector-wide consultation, a bit like we're doing today, should be built to ensure that we're all putting in the same data to the same level, assessed to national standards, which would then lead to a better outcome for all universities participating in whatever the new Excellence in Research for Australia becomes. I really think we need to get this going and agree that we should do this quite urgently. Now, on reviewers, the proposed national system that I just mentioned, a national standard, if you like, ought to give reviewers, experienced and emerging, more confidence in how they assess research. By association, university research committees and research officers confidence in the verifiability of their research output collection, which is scrutinized by external parties. For example, how many people here today have been sent work to assess in whatever system, university committee, or even a creative research journal, that they have really struggled with what to say and how to assess the work? How many can say, hand on heart, that they're really clear, they're crystal clear about the criteria of assessing this work as a research output, and that academic buzzwords, the things like affordances, intersectionality, methodological innovation, that name dropping, the industry awards and the other accolades haven't swayed their thinking about whether this is a research output or not, whether it's a really good industry output that sounds like it probably is research. Think about that yourself and how many times you've experienced that. Are we really sure that what we're looking for that we're looking for the research contribution only, despite how many awards the book has won, how many international festivals the film was played at, or how many aged care facilities that have taken up the co-design framework. All these things that we put into the statements and the supporting evidence of peer review equivalence, very, very blurry lines, I believe, around speaking to the research versus the significance, versus the esteem, versus the industry, versus the community uptake. I think we need to do more work around clarifying what the research criteria is and therefore what we're actually assessing specifically. I suggest that most of us here today oscillate between this looks great and this sounds like pretty standard practice or an industry brief. Oscillate between I have no idea what this research statement means, so it must be genius, and this research statement has clearly been written by someone else to make it sound better than it probably is. Again, I think we've all experienced that. I'm not going to ask for a virtual show of hands of how many people identify with those aspects there, but I think you get my drift with what I'm trying to propose here. And I will end there.
Thank you so much, Craig. Again, thanks for the comments in the chat. We will try and get back to those questions at the end. I am now going to introduce to you Beata Bartorovic, who is the Associate Head in Research and Research Training and Associate Professor in Sculpture, Visual Art in the School of Creative Arts at the University of Southern Queensland. Her artwork and scholarly publications explore the role of visual narratives in engaging with trauma and intergenerational trauma in light of a difficult past. You can read Beata's full profile from the link that Ruth has just put in the chat. And Beata's topic today is research plus versus or industry success. And here is Beata for you.
Thank you so much, Mina. I really appreciate it. And I just want to acknowledge the Djaroa and Gabba peoples, and I'm joining from Toowoomba. And I might just start from a personal point. As a textile-based artist, I like to conceptualize the broader relationship between academia and industry by using the metaphor of the artist as being the needle and the thread, binding disparate fibers, often creating a tension within the very act of binding them, and creating a certain patchwork unique to their vision. In this sense, I wonder whether the artist could be also the translator, the mediator, the trainer across these different contexts of academia and industry. Perhaps the role of the artist is more expansive than we give recognition to within the ARC's assessment and evaluation processes, and perhaps this criteria could be more accommodating at this. On the other side of the spectrum, is there too much responsibility being placed on the artist as a conduit of these two contexts in the creative arts peer review process? And is this too of an onerous task, too prescriptive maybe, taking away artists from their primary aims? These questions propose the difficulties of creative arts assessment and evaluation based on the tension between industry and academia that the artist experiences, because of the different value systems and also different measures of success, such as commercial viability versus academic merit. Both these landscapes have different aims and functions that form the broader cultural ecology of creative arts that potentially troubles the evaluation processes. This is further complicated by the various dimensions of creative research itself. This includes experiential facets, lived experience, informed intuition processes, as integrated knowledges that are often implied, yet provide such richness that are not always well translated or documented within creative arts submissions. I also want to preface this idea of tension in terms of academia and industry as being interconnected in the broader creative arts research ecology of development and contribution. That is, they both feed into each other and notions of success. We need to approach the very idea of tension as no longer considering binary notions of positive and negative outcomes, but spectrums of intensities that can be heightened, complement, and even trigger as useful understandings of the concept of tension. After all, as artists, we look for tension. We create tension as a means of reconsidering ideas of the everyday. As Dawn Manny would say, making the familiar strange, which leads to our unique insights and research outcomes. Tension is what gives artwork strength and resolution that responds to the Nitro criteria, where both academic merit and industry engagement are paramount. There is another tension, which is the tension between research rigour on one hand, innovation and significance, and research relevance on the other that brings us to industry engagement. So this leads me then to the first provocation in the context of tensions. Could the artist be seen as a conduit, bringing together different academic and industry contexts as they navigate their developing and honing agency within their practice? And my second provocation, could training around interconnectivity between industry and academia be offered in navigating the broader creative arts ecology? And what would best practice look like? And the provision of the feedback from such training can enable perhaps more clarity and give weight to the further development of ARC assessment and evaluation processes within the creative arts. This suggestion potentially offers something more holistic, where exchange between the two are offered with an understanding of empowering and expanding the creative arts ecology, not just nationally, but internationally. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Berta. And I'm now going to introduce you to our final speaker today, Professor David Cross, who is Head of Art and Design at Deakin University and with Cameron Bishop co-leads Public Art Commission. His practice across curation, installation and writing examines ideas of time and place in temporary public art practice. And there's a link in the chat there if you would like to read David's full bio. And I will hand over to David now.
Thanks so much, Mina. Good morning, everybody. I'm coming to you from the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung lands, people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. In continuing the conversations that we've had already this morning, I'm going to engage again in the idea of where some of the rougher edges perhaps sit in relation to the evaluation process in ERA, and I'd like to, if I may, offer a provocation around the idea of what we understand as world standard. We all know what we mean by world standard. Curated into the Venice Biennale, commissioned to make an experimental performance work for Prague Quadrennial, invited to screen a feature at Sundance, world standard obviously means working in the leading edge global cultural ecology. Or do we? Is world standard a clearly defined, clearly delineated category, separate, for example, from national standard, or is the water slightly more opaque? While it would be so easy to suggest that world standard is what cuts the mustard in the worlds of so-called peak cultural institutions, festivals, venues, and events, a deeper dive suggests that it is far less straightforward. Might, for instance, a curated exhibition in an alternative space in Berlin look world standard on paper, but in reality lacks either quality assurance mechanisms or a critical rigor? On the flip side, might a different exhibition curated locally in Broken Hill or Murray Bridge have more compelling and rigorous quality assurance mechanisms, selection criteria, and crucially artistic outcomes? Might it be the case that these projects that seem nationally significant are in fact the embodiment of world standard? If we think about this from the point of view of an ERA assessor, there's an assumption that discipline experts are going to know the skinny on every alternative art space in Berlin, or if they don't, can somehow research the venue or institution's status virtually. But one might suggest this is not an especially rigorous or transparent process. Without a directory of every cultural institution on the planet and its quality assurance mechanisms, we, the ERA assessor, fall back on what we know, which is always partial and partisan, as Craig was mentioning before. What about cultural developments in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, and the hundreds of towns and cities in those places? How does or how can an assessor grasp the nuances of the cultural ecology across the diversity of these continents or regions, and be in touch with its assorted zeitgeists. When does a venue, institution become world standard, and how do we measure this? What if the same venue or institution is actually on a decline and trading on bygone glories? A space or venue or institution cutting corners on quality assurance and no longer at the cutting edge, no longer setting the agenda. Is it too easy as a creative arts researcher to show internationally in Berlin, Toronto, or Seoul and simply claim the status of world standard? When it comes to quality assurance, are we able to hide our peas under the mashed potato, so to speak, in playing the international card? Part cargo cult, part colonialist, does this mentality come at the expense of a system that could be seen not to reward far more compelling and rigorous creative projects developed and shown locally and nationally in this country? How, colleagues, to make sense or nonsense of the idea of world standard in our ever-accelerating world? Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, David, and to all of our speakers. I am now going to hand over to Craig, and he's going to mediate the next part of the session, which is the discussion that is open to everybody. If you would like to jump on mic and speak, you can put your hand up and we'll call on you, and we will also dig up some of the questions and comments in the chat and address some of those as well. Thanks so much, Craig.
Thanks, Mia, and thanks everybody for your wonderful provocations and ideas and suggestions. So I'm going to mediate this next session, or maybe I'll curate it and try and claim it as a non-traditional research output because, hey, that's what some people do. We've got 90-odd people here, so, you know, it's kind of world standard. As Mina said, it'd be great if you could, if you're willing to speak, put your hand up and we'll come to you. I might just start from looking at the chat questions. We do have a question from Bettina, which went to Mia specifically. So I might just start with that, if you don't mind, Mia. And this is just a question around expanding on your point about real-world applications as a measure of research value and how that fits in with research that has perhaps more cultural, not commercial value, or research that sits on the edge of accepted practices and therefore not immediately obvious. Do you have anything you'd like to expand on that one?
Yeah, and I thank you very much for that question. And of course, I think the beehive in this room will have lots of expertise to bring to this as well. And I appreciate the word application might send everyone off in a particular direction, and relevance might be an alternative word to use there. I think in broad terms, for me, this is about the external versus the internal focus of research. And, you know, in terms of what we do with our students, we encourage them to engage with external experiences like, you know, work integrated learning, etc. And equally in research, we need to focus our outcomes on that external environment. And of course, much of the creative practice research is already doing that. And it kind of seems really curious to me that through the impact agenda, we can actually, I think, as creative practice researchers, assist our traditional colleagues to be thinking in that way, the kind of external gaze, the external relevance. Now, having said all that, I am a great believer in breadth and as I said, also diversity. I think it's really important that there's space for research that sits on the edge of what might be the convention, that research is something that is challenging, and that there's space for that. So I guess the question around whether it's community or culturally significant or commercially significant is less of interest to me in my provocation there.
Thank you, Mia. And maybe just picking up on that thread of diversity, there was a question from Michelle around expanding on this idea of bringing a diversity lens to research broadly, I guess, but obviously creative practice research. I wonder if any of the speakers have anything, any experiences or ideas or anything they want to say about this idea of diversity.
Can I jump in just very quickly? Yeah, I get quite excited when I think about what future academic professions might look like. Traditionally, it has been, as we know, a profession that has been challenged when it comes to diversity, and it's something that we're obviously working on across the sector. But in terms of working in models where people's identities and can be celebrated within a framework that actually recognises the expertise that you bring, is something that I think will provide a much more lively and interesting place to be. I think also in the kind of AI infused environment that we're going into, and lots of questions about who is an expert and what is an expert, and do we need the types of academic experts that we've previously had, it's going to be increasingly important to have diverse experiences that can provide the kind of space for experimentation, and also provide students with really wide range of lived experiences as academics. So I'm quite optimistic around how this is potentially something that's going to help us articulate the work that we do as creative practitioners.
Thanks, Mia. Anybody else want to say anything on this diversity aspect?
I don't want to take up any more time, really. I'd like to just open out to the panel, but I do want to just say that I feel like one of the gorgeous things about creative practice research and being allowed to do this work in the academy as creative practice researchers is just the risks that we can take and be trusted to take to push into new, unexplored sort of territories without feeling the usual pressures that we would feel in the art world as independent practitioners. And so I think that that's a really valuable space, I guess, to think through in terms of diversity as well and what might be possible. But Craig, could I just draw your attention to Joseph's comment?
Yes.
Yeah, around subjective and objective, because I think that's a really great point. To what extent can we ever escape the subjective in fields where affect reigns, for instance, or
yeah, and that speaks well to Andrew Lavery's comment as well around mitigating faulty world standard claims and subjectivity. And there was a comment in there, a really interesting comment about people claiming things for job applications, promotions, and what is this doing? So yeah, interested to know whether it's David or others around subjectivity, objectivity. How is this possible in creative research? Is it possible? What are the markers? How do we determine them? Are they always emerging, changing? I'd love to talk more about that. David talking?
Yeah, Craig, maybe I'll just respond to, I noticed Andrew's question in the chat around whether having better Australian panel rigor would kind of alleviate some of the problems that I was talking about. And I think to a degree, perhaps, but I think the challenge is, I know the last ERA, I was on the rec panel. I think I might have been one of 2 or 3 max visual arts experts on that panel. And again, this is where the challenge starts to kick in. You know, I guess the provocation I was trying to make this morning was that the art world, contemporary art world, is such an incredibly complex and multifarious entity, particularly outside of our classic Western understandings of where the kind of, you know, the zeitgeist or the leading edges of that are. And the challenge is just knowing that knowledge. So even before we start evaluating ideas of quality within a creative arts context, how are we then supposed to understand the standing or credibility or rigor of so many different institutions across so many cultural contexts? That's part of the challenge. So I think, Andrew, to a degree, a more rigorous Australian panel with greater diversity and greater expertise knowledge, which would require a bigger investment from the ARC in the ERA process, would help. But I still think it comes down to quality assurance largely. I think quality assurance is more important than world standing, because world standing is, if anything, becoming more nebulous as a category. So the challenge, it seems to me, is less about ideas of world or national, and how do we ensure a quality assurance lens across what we do? Because as the point that I made, there are many incredibly great internationally rigorous projects in regional parts of Australia that are heaps more important and rigorous than what happens in New York or Berlin or London. And it's just trying to kind of shift that politic and the cultural cringe perhaps that maybe sits underneath it, that I think is really key in our evaluation process.
Thanks, David. And yeah, the cultural cringe also came up, I think, from Bettina. And is there something in there that's somehow baked into perceptions of this ecosystem of creative research, and how do we mitigate against that? One of the purposes of this forum and other stuff we're doing collectively is to really try and get a seat at the table of whatever these, you know, Canberra-led discussions and policies are taking place. And Julianne mentions in there about the ERA transition working group and whether there was creative representation. There were some HAS people broadly, I think history, philosophy, law, not creative people. So, you know, what can we do to ensure that creative disciplines are actually represented in these really important groups, forums, task forces, etc., in order that it's not front and center per se, but it is actually verbalized, that we talk about creative rather than just arts and humanities more broadly. Can I just pick up on a question or a comment that came up from Daniel Palmer? And there was another question I saw, which I think ties into this, maybe from Bettina as well. And thank you, Daniel, for recognizing my little joke. So my little joke is clearly not well standard, but that's fine. The joke's on me. So we often have discussions around, you know, creative research. Is it research or is it engagement? If people are working with non-creative researchers on interdisciplinary projects, what is their role? Are they equal researchers, or are they just the engagement and impact kind of producers that are brought in? Keen to get some thoughts, ideas, experiences on this often blurry line between research and engagement work. Anybody want to kick off on that topic? That to include not just the speakers today, but anybody who might have something to say.
Craig, hello everybody. Since you mentioned my name, I feel I should put my hand up, but sorry, I can see someone else has their hand up. In my experience, we just tend to come back to the definition of research when that eventuates. So I don't have anything really more to say about it, but it opens up the impact assessment exercise for me very much as well. But I'd like to hear from others. Thanks.
And Andrew.
Craig, I'm finding that university is becoming more amenable to this form of practice, and both as engagement, but as a form of research that attracts very large audiences, and that's finding its way into academic excellence framework assessments now. So promotion, but they're also seeing it as research now as well. So I think things are shifting in this space.
Good to hear. Tali, great.
Hi, yeah, I'm really hearing so many great things from this discussion. It's just, yeah, fantastic to have these conversations. I guess I'm slightly nervous that going too far and putting too many eggs in the impact basket means that our research or the creative research gets understood only in that lens. And we get further and further away from some of the more difficult discussions to have about the work as research. And even though sometimes it's clear that it is being understood as research, even within an impact frame, I think there's when we say these words that things are shifting and that we're developing and we're doing the work and we're getting understood in that space, that shift is not a linear pathway from lack of recognition to recognition. For me, what's involved in that shift is often our changing contexts in which we are having those discussions. And those are things outside of our control. And so what I'm finding is that every time there is a new leadership team, a new person in a leadership team in my university, I'm starting from scratch in having some of those conversations and doing that work to explain the background here, and that is happening outside of the university as well. Whenever these contexts shift, that's where we get purchase or not purchase. And so that's not something that we can control. And I would like to see work towards that standardization work that has been mentioned several times this morning from these great presentations, in order to not necessarily consolidate the work that we do in the assessment stage. Although, I agree, Craig, that there are, personal things that come into making those assessments. I think there's personal things that come into making assessments about traditional research as well. There's no difference there for me between those two kinds of research assessments. What I think it can be the game changer here is give it what was mentioned maybe by you, Craig, as giving confidence to leadership teams to accept the evaluations. That's the missing piece that I would like to see some collaborative national benchmarking standardization work, so that we can have that second layer of validity to accept what a local team does to create assessments. That's my view.
Thanks, Tali, that's great. And it's really interesting, isn't it, the point you make there about, if someone changes role, you get a new leader of whatever type, the discussions start again. And I'm sure many universities have experienced that. And so it raises the question, what is missing outside of the university at the national level that is just a thing that everyone just says, well, of course it's that, rather than having to reinvent the wheel. So good point. Mia and then Danny.
Just a quick kind of personal experience from that. I found in my work, which is pretty much all interdisciplinary, that by coming into the beginning phase of a project and clearly stating that these are the kind of questions that I'm interested in exploring from my research, and this is the contribution that my part of this project makes to my discipline, is really helpful. And I found that my collaborators from other disciplines readily accept that. It means it's not seen as a kind of service provider, or in my case, a media production that is something they could actually pay an external media producer to do. But I think being really clear on what it is that you're doing in a team and how that is research from the outset helps with any confusion about whether your role is this or that.
Yeah, and that also speaks to the idea of confidence and language and going into those meetings, discussions, grant applications with a clear confidence about what the research is, rather than trying to, speak as if you're like a glorified production company, or maybe unglorified, depending who you are. Danny.
Thanks, Craig. Thanks, everyone. Great discussion, much needed. I just want to pick up on, I guess, with what David's saying about quality assurance, and that was a really big part of the early stages of the discussion about evaluation of non-traditional research outputs or artistic research. And I really agree that there's just a lack of clarity in how that's articulated, and it would be really useful for us to be able to work on that articulation in a collective way. But then, I think also there is the question of peer esteem and sort of presentation venues and commissioning venues as kinds of proxies for excellence, I guess, and how we balance these kinds of what I see as a tendency towards evaluation towards excellence, which suits certain kinds of institutions, probably my own included, versus evaluating kind of, quality assurance, which might have a more disciplinary character, perhaps. That's a real problem that we have to collectively work out, because I think the danger is that as we try and work nationally on resolving that tension, we potentially reintroduce an institutional segmentation between haves and have-nots in research, or excellent institutions and less excellent institutions. And as we know, those can be weaponized by our institutions in ways that will inevitably have a negative impact on our fields and our disciplines. So I just wanted to sound that as a potential note of caution for us, as I'd be really, thrilled to see this group kind of work towards, this national articulation. But I do think we have to be sensitive to those different institutional positions and the potential of the excellence discourse to start to reintroduce some of those distinctions that hopefully, as practitioners, we're moving away from. Thanks.
Thanks, Danny. I guess another thought that just came to mind there was, particularly because you mentioned your own university, and the different types of university that we have that are, I would argue, becoming increasingly different. So you think about the big metropolitans who've got 60,000 students and, I don't know, 250 creative researchers, versus maybe a regional university that has 10 creative researchers across 4 campuses, and just the difficulty it can be to gain momentum, and what kinds of research questions are not just of interest to those different groups, but are actually possible. What work can they do, and how do we then judge excellence in a regional context where there might be different access to resources, communities, galleries, etc., versus someone who might live right next door to one of the major galleries. So there's something interesting there. If anybody has any comments, please put your hand up. I might just pick up on a comment, given there's no hands up at the minute. A couple of comments around artistic practice, grant funding for non-academic artists, etc. And I know that some of the panel members have successfully navigated the system of gaining some arts funding for creative arts, creative research projects. And I just wondered if anybody would like to speak to that interesting opportunity, but also tension around, applying for grants from Australia Council, for example, or state-funded arts organisations as a researcher. Do we identify as researchers when we apply? Because it might have it might sway the assessment, but at the same time, we definitely use it in our research statements to show that we've been peer reviewed. So would anybody like to talk a little bit about arts funding as a creative arts researcher? Or anybody in the whole room? Andrew?
I find our academics often steer away from identifying as academic researchers when they make those funding applications because they think that that would disadvantage them. So that's nearly always the case. But yes, when it comes to speaking internally about the research achievements, they would speak to that as some research.
So the question is that, is that good? Is it bad? Is that nefarious somehow? Like, what is that, and why are we doing it? I mean, well, we know why we're doing it, but just interesting questions around, again, markers of excellence. It was peer reviewed by a panel of whoever, but actually it wasn't. It wasn't peer reviewed in the same conditions or context. It was put in differently, potentially. I know some people would put in differently, but interesting questions. And then if you're assessing that as a reviewer for ERA or whatever, how do you take that information? Joseph and then Jess.
Just to the other side of that coin, I know that there are a lot of academics who don't feel it fair to be applying for money from external grant funders like the Australia Council because they feel that they have stability of employment in a research artistic research environment, and that by applying for money from the Australia Council, they'll be taking money from artists, and it's such a limited pool there. I think that also there's a really good comment in the chat about the suspicion from creative arts peers about academic motives in applying for funding. So I think that's also relevant, and I agree with that.
Yeah.
I was just going to say exactly the same thing. I know that this is an ongoing discussion amongst colleagues around the ethical kind of considerations of taking funding from independent artists and what that funding will be used for. But also equally, there are pressures on academics to bring in funding, and that for creative practice researchers, often these are the avenues that we have to pursue. And I also know many academics will apply outside externally from the university and then take time off work, paid leave, in order to undertake that work, which I also think is I'm not quite sure is the right pathway, that we're fostering an environment where we're sort of balancing all these different kinds of approaches. But yeah, I don't have any solutions or resolutions there, but it's something that kind of intrigues and bothers me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And just looking at a few of the comments there, there's something interesting about that notion of, what kind of research are we doing, and why are we doing it, and who is it for, and who's involved? So, the difference, for example, picking up on Kat's comment there, Kat Hope's comment, the difference between, just for example, applying for a creative research grant or whatever to do an individual work versus applying for a grant to run a project that would then employ other people to be paid to do the work. And there's something interesting for me about that. You think about people applying for ARC grants, for example, like what is the work for? Who's gonna benefit from the outputs? You'd think, oh, well, it's all the same, but actually it isn't. And so some of them is very much in service of the wider world, and others it's not. So there's just some interesting tensions there, I think. Jess.
Just to add, I mean, I have had conversations with people just specifically from the Literature Board of Australia Council, or now Creative Australia and Creative Victoria, before, about the relationship between sort of university projects or carried out by staff at universities versus sort of external, and what that relationship can be. And I wonder if part of the work that needs to be done is really just more conversations with those funding bodies, and and maybe even thinking about separate panels, but I'm not sure how that would fly. Yeah.
And then Andrea raises a good question, or a couple of questions there about how can we ensure that creative arts is represented in, for example, HAS panels on ARC and other areas, even in panels such as NHMRC, where often creative methods or design thinking is brought into these things. How can we individually, but also as a group, really ensure that we're at those tables to be part of the discussions, to ensure that creatives are not overlooked? And then how does that speak to excellence? What are we, do we think that if people were to look at all the disciplines across Australia in this context, would people see that creative fields are excellent research fields, or would they look at them and go, well, there's no representation here, no one ever gets the grant, so it must be a lower type of research field compared to even history and education, as Andrew mentions there? Any views on how we're actually seen as a field in the national context as research specific? Andrea, hi.
Hello, everyone. So nice to see old RMIT faces. I think that we are seen. I've recently done a trip to Europe and spoken to a lot of people about creative practice-based research there and found varying attitudes. But I think we Australians are seen as leading internationally in terms of the methodologies. But I still think, even in saying that, there's a sort of attitude, particularly one really important media philosopher that I spoke with in Germany. His attitude was that creative practice PhDs needed to be called something other than a PhD. So I had some really confronting attitudes like that put in front of me. So I think we're doing all the right things, but I think this issue of representation is really important, and it speaks to excellence across the board, like as a community, perhaps more so than individuals, because it's about the sustainability of what we're doing, encouraging people to come up through the ranks. And I think it's really difficult, like being 5 years out of my PhD and looking at all the other creative practitioners who have come through at a similar time. It's really difficult to gain ongoing employment. I think that, we have experiences where we get really great fellowships for like 18 months, and then, you might be applying for those arts funding opportunities during that time, and therefore you are seen as supported, and yet you're not really if you're out of a job in 4 months' time. So yeah, there are a lot of issues around that, but I think I'm really keen to see more representation. I think my experience of applying for the DDCA was really enlightening, in that I saw the main thing I had to write in my rejoinder was a defense of creative practice-based methodology, which I had rigorously prepared, knowing that that would be a potential downfall, the panel that it was going to, the HAS panel. So I think that was really interesting as well, to see just this complete lack of understanding. And I had 4 reviewers, so it was quite good responses there. But yeah, I think most of them took issue with creative methodology and were asking very basic questions that showed a complete lack of understanding of this as a methodology. And I made a comment up above where I also mentioned the 4 code system, which, with our 4 codes, that could go to a theorist or a creative methodologist. And in sciences, they all know that they're going towards the 4 codes select for scientific positivism, more or less. It's a bit of a generalization, but more or less they know that they're going to someone well-versed in their methodology. For us, it's like a roll of the dice. So I think that's another issue. That's why I think if we can have our own panels that select for methodology, I think that would be the ideal. I know it's a really difficult ask, but I think that would be an ideal situation.
Thanks, Andrea. It is interesting because you do see DECRAs, future fellows, laureates, etc., that are creative in some way, but often that's not necessarily the lead piece. It's often like a research question about something else. that might use the methods or the methodology, but it's actually framed quite specifically as about something else. And that just raises interesting questions around, I guess, from an excellence point of view, like, what is an excellent creative-based research question? Does it have to be about something else? Or can it be about practice process? Clearly, the evidence from ARC in particular, but that's just one scheme, is that it's, things that are not about something else and not valued. That's the clear evidence from funding decisions. Is that right? Is that wrong? Something to grapple with. I might just turn, no virtual hands, I might just turn to a comment here from Scott. It's really interesting. It's about obsession with global rankings. I guess you're talking there quite specifically about data, citations, like if global rankings are fed by these things, including employer reputation and whatever, but if they're fed by data, do we have the data that we need to be part of that conversation, or is it too complicated, too hard? It's going to take too long to develop data sets for creative research. Therefore, quick wins for universities, just invest in the non-creative disciplines that can quickly gather the data that would feed rankings. Love to know any experiences or views on that aspect from people. Anybody? A few data geeks here, I know that much.
Well, Craig, I suppose I was just going to say that, it's far easier for universities to feed into those global ranking systems with existing citation data and weighted, fields, citations, etc. I think even if you look at the discipline-based rankings for the creative disciplines, it's a lot of bias towards the reputation survey, which of course has a load of biases in it anyway, probably to do with how big the university is, how big their marketing budgets are, everything else. So it's fraught with a whole load of problems. And I just think over the last 10 years, we've seen a proliferation of rankings, but it just pushes the universities down to invest more in the sciences and STEM disciplines. So it feels, I think, for many creative practitioners that we've been squeezed.
But maybe excellence is only achieved through bias. There's a question. At least excellence as perceived by others. Julianne.
Thanks, Craig. I was just going to go to your conversation about excellence, and I think it's a great idea to try and have a kind of national multi-art form conversation about what excellence looks like. But I would also sort of caution against focusing entirely on excellence, because I think one of the things that ERA was trying to do that had a positive impact on us as a kind of broad disciplinary category, creative arts, was that excellence was part of what they were trying to do, but they were also trying to inform decision making and demonstrate quality. And so I think those two aspects need to come into a conversation about excellence as well. That excellence itself, I think, is too narrow a lens at times. And so if we can think about myriad qualitative and quantitative ways to kind of demonstrate all three of those things, then we've kind of got a bit of a smorgasbord, perhaps, for artist academics and for their assessors in a way that doesn't sort of close down the conversation, but rather sort of makes it a little bit more open to possibilities and to differences amongst different disciplines. Like with books and writing, for example, we often get caught with, so-called impact measures, because they'll be all about audience participation or something like that, which is incredibly difficult to speak about in terms of books and writing, because you can't sort of really have individual conversations with individual readers. So yeah, I would just make that point. I think it's a great endeavour, but I think a broader focus rather than just excellence alone would be a better way to go.
No, that's really great. Thanks, Julianne. And I'm just thinking here about the research statement, and when you think about the contribution part, is that more about quality? Is the significance more about excellence? You often see things in significance, the kind of the markers, but does that somehow undermine the contribution section? And is that where the quality is, and is that what excellence is? Just plugging it out there. We've got a question from Sane, and I think we might just have this as a final question, just so we can then spend a couple of minutes wrapping up. Sane, nice to see you. Thanks, and over to you.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yes, hi there. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a point made by, I think it was Amanda, about the DECRA proposal that she had been exploring. Some of you might know I do have a DECRA, and in this space, with the FOR code was 1905. I know it's changed now, whatever the relative one is now in the creative arts. I'm not sure off by heart, 30601. But it was, so I guess I'm just highlighting that there is a precedent. It has been done. When I did that, applied for that DECRA, I had 0 traditional research outputs. 100% of my research outputs were basically my exhibition track record as a contemporary artist. But what I happened to, as I was preparing that proposal, and was in a lot of workshops at University of Sydney with my colleagues in the school, so not in creative arts, but in writing, all the humanities basically, and performance art. The challenge was the same for them, is what I realized, is basically, as a Shakespearean scholar, for example, adjacent to me, she was saying, how can I argue for impact and relevance in a contemporary context? I felt like they were sort of being faced with the same challenges as the creative visual arts. And of course, as part, so I think if we're going for ARCs, if you want to preserve the purity of visual art, or the sort of the discursive, more, I guess, introspective, self-reflective scholarship of visual art, then ARC might not be the context for that. Whereas if you're able to sort of leverage your research into a more interdisciplinary space, so for example, my project I aligned with it was on public. I framed it specifically in public art, and then I could speak to urban planning, etc., landscape architecture, and as a result, I still have my contemporary art practice, but I don't engage in the ARC framework for that. That's a different kind of research. So, for better or worse, I guess that's the way I gamed the system, if you like, like sort of siphoning off part of my practice to make it that could be applied to these more interdisciplinary frameworks.
Very useful, Sally. Thank you. It looks like you're in the park as well right now. So
I am, which is why I've had my camera off.
Practicing there. Look, we are just coming to time. We've just got a couple of minutes for this next step. So I just want to, first of all, say thank you to everybody for coming along, to our speakers, particularly for presenting, and for a really rich discussion, which we really hope will be the first of many. We're really keen, easier said than done, but we're really keen not just to keep talking about these things, but actually progress and to kind of try and make some change and to inform policy decisions and other things. So we're really keen to do that. So thank you all for coming today to this really, really great session. I might just quickly hand over to Mina just to confirm the next steps with what we're doing with the resources from today, and a call for people to submit responses and thoughts from today to the next issue of Creative Matters.
Thanks, Craig. Well, I am going to do my best to write a summary of the excellent conversations, both on video and in the chat, that will be published as the editorial for the next edition. Or not the next edition. The next edition that's coming out will be our climate in Australia edition, and the one after that will be this special issue. So if you go to the Creative Matters homepage, you will see a call for that in the news section. And it would be excellent for anyone that wants to elaborate on what they've said, or anything anyone wants to contribute to that, up to 800 words, please email those through to me for inclusion in that edition. We will also be posting this recording on the website next week. So you will have this as a reference if you need it, and for the people that haven't been able to make it or stay for the full session. I think that's all I have to say, Craig. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you. And just a reminder, there are some links in the chat to the various things we've talked about today. We do now have a pretty active LinkedIn page as well. Not that we're saying that's going to suddenly elevate us to excellent research, but it's a good place to keep connected to what we're doing, as well as, of course, subscribing to Creative Matters, which is our online publication. Obviously, it's free. Thank you so much, everybody. Really great to see many familiar faces, but also some new faces in the room today. We'll keep in touch via the DDCA, and we'll hope to progress these matters in a creative way in the coming weeks or months and years. And then hopefully we'll get there, whatever there is. We really want everybody to be on this journey with us, and we'll certainly be looking for people to help with things if we get the opportunity to progress at a national level. Thanks very much. Enjoy the rest of your day and lovely weekend ahead. And see you at the next thing.